Good evening, everybody. Welcome. We're really glad to see you here. Happy President's Day. My name is Brian Franklin. If you don't know me, I'm the Associate Director of the Center for Presidential History here at SMU. And on behalf of all of my colleagues, I want to welcome you to our event tonight. I want to thank two SMU partners up front here who have helped make tonight possible. One is the Clements Department of History, especially our department chair, Andrew Graybill, and also the Dedman College Interdisciplinary Institute, especially Lisa Saraganian and her stewardship of the Scott Hawkins Lecture Fund. Those have both helped us to put on this evening. We've got several other exciting events coming up this spring, and I just want to put a few of them on your radar. You can find all of them on our website at any point at smu.edu/cph. First, coming up just in 2 days, on Wednesday, we have a big event, Impeachment, an American History. This event features 4 authors of the book by the same name, our own director, Jeffrey Engel, Peter Baker of the New York Times, Timothy Naftali of NYU, formerly of the Nixon Library, and John Meacham. And it will be moderated by Chris Boyd from KERA's Think. We'll be meeting over at the Hughes Trigg Student Center because we're expecting upwards of 500 people at this event, which is really exciting, and we don't want to sit on one another's laps in here. So we'll be meeting over there. I don't understand why people think this is an applicable or interesting event at this point of history, but people are fickle. What can you say? Over the next month, we'll also host a couple of other great lectures. One by Richard Emerwar for his new book, How to Hide an Empire, A History of the Greater United States. And we'll welcome the director of the LBJ Presidential Library to talk about his newest book, LBJ's 1968, Power Politics and the Presidency in America's Year of Upheaval. I also want to mention really quick another really exciting initiative here at the CPH, which we've mentioned to you before, our D-Day travel course. This will happen in May, which is only 3 months away. This opportunity brings together SMU students, alumni, and friends of the center for a 10-day journey through Operation Overlord, the June 1944 invasion of Normandy that began Europe's liberation from Nazi rule. If you are interested in attending this trip, I am told that I'm giving you the absolute last call. So if you're interested in attending, you should find one of us from the CPH, especially our coordinator, Ronna Spitz, ASAP. But if you cannot join us this year, but you want to participate, we invite you to participate by giving. Any gift that you give to the CPH will support student scholarships for SMU students who want to go on this trip and have this sort of opportunity of a lifetime. And then you can sign up and go with us the next time we do it. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce our featured guest for this evening, Dr. Erica Armstrong Dunbar. Dr. Dunbar is the Charles and Mary Beard Professor of History at Rutgers University. Previously, she taught at the University of Delaware and served as the inaugural director of the program in African American history at the Library Company in Philadelphia, which is one of the premier places for early American research in the world. Dr. Armstrong Dunbar has a remarkable skill, helping us think about American history, or in our case this evening, presidential history, in ways that we just don't usually think about it. And I'm not the only one who lauds her work. Just one example for you. A few months ago, Dr. Armstrong Dunbar's book, Never Caught, which is the basis of tonight's talk, was named the 2018 co-winner of the Frederick Douglass Prize, awarded by the Gilder Lehrman Center of American History for, quote, the best book written in English on slavery or abolition in the year. This is one of the most prestigious prizes in our profession, so move over Pulitzer. This is exactly why yeah, that's it. This is why we've invited her to share with us tonight. In case you forgot, today is President's Day. And I think it's safe to say that when it's President's Day, we expect to talk about 2 things, George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. And we want to debate which president is greater. We want to debate why our current president believes he's more presidential than Washington, but less presidential than Lincoln. His words. We laud Washington's leadership through the Revolution and the founding era. Our kids, our grandkids create construction paper silhouettes in their classes and give speeches about presidential leadership. And all of these things are really important presidential topics, and they're at the heart of the story of George Washington. But something else is at the heart of presidential and Washington as well. That's slavery. For far longer than Washington presided over the country, he presided over a plantation filled with people he had enslaved. And these people, including Ona Judge, are at the heart of the republic and the presidency every bit as much as Alexander Hamilton, even if they didn't write Federalist Papers or inspire Broadway musicals. Yet, Ona Judge the musical coming. So let me tell you, there is truly, absolutely no one on this planet who can tell you this story better or give you this angle on President's Day so well as our guest tonight. So let's welcome with me Dr. Erica Armstrong Dunbar.
Oh, thank you. That was one of the best introductions I've had, so I'm coming back next year. First, let me just thank Jeffrey Engel and Brian. You guys have been so wonderful. We've been working on this presentation, me coming for, I think, almost a year, at least getting things together so that I could come and join you. It's actually my first, I've spent the past 2 years since the book came out sort of touring all over the nation, and I think this is my first time in Texas doing it. So SMU is the first to invite me, so thank you for having me. Tonight I'm going to talk a little bit, I'm going to do a couple of things here. I'm going to lecture, I'm going to talk rather about the book, but I'm also going to read a little bit from the book too. I do think that it's helpful for you to sort of hear the tone, and we'll have a little bit of time for Q&A as well. I'm also going to talk a little bit about how I came to this project and what it's done for me as an historian, and sort of the next steps. 42 years ago in January, ABC, the American Broadcasting Company, made history. My generation and those older than I remember the broadcast of the television miniseries Roots, the saga of an American family based on Alex Haley's novel. Roots aired in 1977 and was seen by over 100 million viewers. It was one of the most watched television broadcasts. It won 9 Emmy Awards. It was seen by over 100 million viewers. It was one of the most watched television broadcasts ever. Everyone in Black Hollywood was in Roots. I was in first grade when Roots aired. And my parents believed that my sister and I should watch every night of the miniseries. It was like 8 nights. That was a lot of Roots. I remember carefully spreading our Raggedy Ann blankets on the floor, preparing to watch ABC's presentation. And as a family, we watched a young Kunta Kinte endure kidnappings and beatings and the degradation of the auction block. Viewers were introduced to characters who, although trapped in the unimaginable violence of slavery, managed to find and maintain dignity. It wasn't until I was much older that I understood the importance of Roots to American families, especially Black families. My parents and most of Black America wanted desperately to climb out of television's Black history famine. Shortly after its premiere, Roots was plagued with controversy regarding the authenticity of Alex Haley's research and his scholarship, but families like mine held fast to the importance of the miniseries. We had no alternatives. Many criticized the romanticized relationships that appeared in Roots, but it really didn't matter to us. We were grateful to find our history make its way to prime time, grateful that the stories of the enslaved were available to a large audience, grateful that Kunta Kinte had become a household name. Now, I had no idea that this moment in 1977 would help shape my professional trajectory. When I think about what prompted me to become an historian and a writer, I think about the power of roots. And eventually, it would help to define my passion for writing histories of the enslaved and delivering that history to a larger public. About 15 years ago, I was completing some research for my first book. I write about basically Black women in the early American Republic in the 19th century, and mostly those Black women sort of living in the North, and how they moved out of slavery, how they became free. And so I'm finishing up this book. And I'm sitting in the archives. I'm at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. And I'm doing what historians do. I'm like rooting through old newspapers. That's what we do to kind of get a feel for everyday life at the end of the 18th century. And so I'm looking through microfilm, and I come across a runaway slave advertisement. And I thought, I looked at the date. It was the May of 1796 issue of the Philadelphia Gazette. And I thought, that's kind of odd. Slavery's almost over in a place like Philadelphia. Who is advertising for a runaway slave in the newspaper? And the next sort of sentence just stopped me sort of in my tracks. It read something like, absconded from the household of the President of the United States. And I was like, whoa. Who ran away from, what president? Then I'm doing the math, 1796. That's George Washington. Okay, wait. George Washington is advertising for a runaway slave in Philadelphia in 1796? And I read on. And it told me who that slave was, and they called her Ona Judge. In all of the records at Mount Vernon, she's referred to as Oni. I argue that Oni was the diminutive of her name, like a Bobby, Billy, Timmy. I call her Ona, which is the name that she went by at the end of her life as a marker of adult dignity. I wondered, who was this woman? What happened to her? She ran off. Were they able to find her? And I sort of immediately I was talking to graduate students earlier today. At first, I got really excited, then nervous that someone else would find the story, and some journalist who writes real fast, and they'd come in, and I'd be left with no book, right? And I didn't know that it would be a book at first. I thought, I got to do the research. Maybe I should bring it into the first book, and then I decided, no, there's something here, and this is going to take time and energy and work, and I'm going to come back to it. And so I finished the first book, got my tenure, did all that, and returned. That's important. And I returned immediately to think about Ona Judge. I vowed to figure out what happened to her, and this led me on a 9-year trail of uncovering the life of one of the most incredible women I've ever encountered in the archives. And I'm going to invite you to walk with me through the end of the 18th century. Rain drenched the streets of Philadelphia in 1796. Weather in the city of brotherly love was often fickle at this time of year, vacillating between extreme cold and oppressive heat. But rain was almost always appreciated in the nation's capital. It erased the putrid smells of rotting food, of animal waste and filth that permeated the cobblestone roads of a new nation. It reminded Philadelphians that the long and punishing winter was behind them. Spring rain brought optimism and hope and a feeling of rebirth. But in the midst of the promises of spring, Ona Judge, a young enslaved woman, received devastating news. She learned that she was to leave Philadelphia, a city that had become her home. Judge was to travel back to her birthplace of Virginia and prepare herself to be given away as a wedding gift to her owner's granddaughter. Today, I'll introduce one of the most understudied fugitive slaves in America. At the age of 22, Judge literally stole herself from the Washingtons, forcing the president to show his slave-catching hand. As a fugitive, Judge would test the president's will and his reputation. The most important man in the nation, heralded with winning the American Revolution, could not seem to capture his enslaved woman. Ona Judge did what very few people had done before. She beat the president. Judge was never caught. And I always sort of take this moment to talk a little bit about the title, Never Caught. As I said, I worked on the book for 9 years. And, I'd worked with the editor. She was happy with the manuscript, finally turned it in, kind of thought I was in the clear. And then I got that dreaded call from marketing. And of course, they hadn't read the book. But they said, Erica, we have a problem. I said, okay, well, what's the problem? This is all on the phone. And they said, we hate your title. I was like, what, why? I've worked with this title, Never Caught, since I started working on this project. And they're like, Erica, you're giving the story away. And I sort of paused, and I was like, okay, well, we have other examples of narratives, of novels, of plays where sort of similar things were at play. 12 years a slave. He was going to be a slave for 12 years. Something was going to happen at the end, but, right? Death of a salesman. We knew how that was going to shake out. But in reality, they wanted me to use, they didn't like the term, because the phrase never caught, because they thought it was sort of giving something away, but also they wanted me to use sort of words like free or freedom, finding freedom, something, I don't even remember. But I was very firm, and I said, no, I'm not using those words, because in reality, Ona Judge was never free. She was simply never caught. And that's an important distinction for me to make. So I won that battle. And I had a strong editor who supported me. I gave them the Washington's Relentless Pursuit, that was them. And that's okay, because it's sort of important, especially sort of later on in the book. But I always sort of like to give a little feedback about even the title, and we could even talk about later on during Q&A if you'd like, the cover, the jacket itself. This is an image of Mount Vernon a little bit later, 1872. I always show this image when I'm teaching students, and it's a little bit later, of course, because Ona died in 1848. But I like to use this image because I want students in particular to sort of have a visual of the place in which she was born and spent her early years. So this is, for those of you who have not been to Mount Vernon, this is sort of the back of the estate, and you look out, you see the Potomac River. It's absolutely beautiful. And I like for students to see kind of the beauty of the image of Mount Vernon, but also to wrestle with the difficulties of the fact that at George Washington's death, over 300 enslaved people lived here. Tonight, I introduce a new American hero, an enslaved girl raised at Mount Vernon who, once exposed to freedom, was compelled to pursue it at any cost. This was a woman who found the courage to defy the President of the United States, the wit to find allies, to outnegotiate, to run, to escape, and to survive. Her story is the only existing account that we have of a fugitive once held by the Washingtons, and we think that it's actually the only existing account of an 18th century fugitive from Virginia. She guarded what she believed was her right for freedom every day of her life, never regretting her decision to fight for what she believed to be her right. Ona was born sometime in 1773-74. I don't have an exact birth date. And I always, since I've been talking more to younger readers these days, I ask the 4th and 5th graders, why don't I have a birth date for Ona Judge? And their hands go up quickly, they're sharp. And they say, they didn't care about birth dates for the enslaved. And I'm like, you're right. That's exactly right. So we don't have a birth date, anything written, but from corroborating evidence, I was able to pin down that she's born sometime between 1773 and 1774. Betty was her mother. Betty was an enslaved woman, technically owned by Martha Washington. She was a seamstress and a spinner, and well-liked by the family. Just as a sort of American history reminder, Martha Washington was married once before George, right? So George Washington's her second husband. And when Martha was married to her first husband, he died and left her a very wealthy widow. She had a tremendous amount of wealth in the form of property and in the form of slaves, so that when George married Martha, as my grandmother said, he came up, right, in that relationship, right? He married in the money. He was he was nowhere near that stature in terms of wealth. So when Martha and George married, she brought some of her slaves with her. Betty was one of them, who came as a seamstress and a spinner. Andrew Judge was Ona's father. He was a white indentured servant. Washington had purchased his indenture agreement in Baltimore sometime in 1772. He was known for making some of the more important uniforms that Washington wore during the Revolution. I don't know the nature of the encounter between Betty and Andrew. I try not to use the word relationship because I don't know what it was. I don't know if this was a consensual relationship, or, and I see some young people in our audience, the opposite of a consensual relationship. But what's important is that Andrew Judge was the only person at Mount Vernon with the last name of Judge. He was the only person in all of Fairfax County with the last name of Judge. So I don't have a birth certificate or anything that says Andrew Judge is Ona's father. Andrew Judge was Ona's father, right? We also have a description of Ona as a mixed race person. He was a tailor, her mother was a seamstress. She's born in 1773 or 4. At the age of 10, Ona was brought up to work in the mansion house. Her childhood ends. She's brought up to basically become a seamstress and a spinner, much like her mother. And at some point in her sort of early teenage years, she becomes Martha Washington's favorite slave. I don't have a better phrase for that, but her go-to person. She was responsible for the most intimate of duties. She would help Martha Washington bathe. She would brush her hair. She would make her clothing and clean it. She was always there, present, but supposedly unseen. And so it's this status as her sort of favorite slave that changes Ona's life. In 1789, George Washington is elected President of the United States. He must move and leave and go to New York. This is the one moment where I owe a debt of gratitude to Lin-Manuel Miranda, because at least my students know that the nation's capital was in New York, at least at first. And so he leaves to go to New York. He goes alone. Martha Washington is unhappy about the move, unwilling to move. Eventually she does, and when they go, they choose 7 enslaved people to travel with them. Ona's one of them. And so I'm going to read briefly from the book about this moment that Ona is taken from her family. The young Ona Judge was far from an experienced traveler. The teenager knew only Mount Vernon and its surroundings, and had never traveled far from her family and loved ones. For Judge, the move must have been similar to the dreaded auction block. Although she was not to be sold to a different owner, she was forced to leave her family for an unfamiliar destination hundreds of miles away. Judge would have no choice but to stifle the terror she felt and to go on about the work of preparing to move, folding linens, packing Martha Washington's dresses and personal accessories, and helping with the grandchildren were the tasks at hand. And it wasn't her place to complain or question. Judge had to remain strong and steady, if not for herself, then for her mistress, who appeared to be falling apart at the seams. Like Judge, Martha Washington had no choice about the move to New York. Her life was at the direction of her husband, who was now the most powerful man in the country. Mrs. Washington and Ona Judge may have shared similar concerns, but of course only Martha Washington could express discontent and sorrow. Martha Washington was unhappy, and everyone knew it, including her frightened slave. The president's nephew, Robert Lewis, would also soon be made aware of it. When he arrived at the estate on May 14th, things were in disarray. Lewis, who served as Washington's secretary between 1789 and 91, was chosen to escort his aunt and her grandchildren to New York, but was surprised and a bit concerned when he arrived to find a frenzied and hectic scene. Lewis wrote, "Everything appeared to be in confusion," the manifestation of Mrs. Washington's conflicting feelings. Robert Lewis described the departure, which finally took place on May 16th, 1789, as an emotional moment for the slaves and the First Lady. He wrote, quote, "After an early dinner and making all necessary arrangements in which we were greatly retarded, it brought us to 3:00 in the afternoon when we left Mount V. The servants of the house and a number of the field Negroes made their appearance to take leave of their mistress. Numbers of these poor wretches seemed greatly agitated, much affected. My aunt equally so," end quote. Betty, Ona Judge's mother, must have been one of those agitated slaves. Not only was she losing her 16-year-old daughter, but she was also losing her son Austin, who would serve as one of the Washington's waiters. Austin's wife Charlotte and their children would have joined in the morning. Betty watched her children leave Mount Vernon, a reminder of what little control enslaved mothers had over the lives of their children. If she found any comfort that day, it would have been that brother and sister were traveling together. Austin was older and male, and could look out for his younger sister, but still Betty knew that her relationship with her children would never be the same. And so this is the moment that Ona leaves Mount Vernon, heads to New York, and it would be the first place that she would encounter Black freedom. And while slavery was still very present in New York, super present in New York, it was actually, though, the first time that she would move about a city where Black freedom was not odd. Her stay in New York was brief. They would move to Philadelphia. The nation's capital would move to Philadelphia in 1790. I always showed this image. It's a lithograph from later on from the 1830s of the president's house in Philadelphia where they would live. And I always show this image to students because I want them to understand what an 18th century president's house looked like. It's not a sort of White House or Mar-a-Lago, wherever presidents live these days, right? I want them to know, like, to look at this. By our standards, it's relatively modest. For theirs, not as much. But there are 3 floors to this house. And for those of you who are familiar with Philadelphia, this actually sits right sort of a few feet from the Liberty Bell. And they've done some work. There was some sort of work. They were getting ready. I think they were going to plan some parking in Philadelphia, but they started doing some digging, and this is always what happens in old cities, right? You start digging to build some condos or whatever, a playground, and the next thing you find, ruins of the old president's house, and also a tunnel that was very clear that had been used by the enslaved. And so the plan was to kind of cover over this, make some parking or whatever the structure was that they wanted to make. And some Philadelphia activists said, absolutely not. We're going to uncover this. We're going to have archaeologists come in. We're going to show the remaining sort of cornerstones that existed for the house. And we're going to use this as a sort of teachable moment because here you have where the president's house stood, where at this point 9 enslaved people lived, which is a stone's throw from the Liberty Bell and Constitution Hall. Right? And so they worked hard, and Philadelphia, this as a city, recognizes. So if you go to the Liberty Bell now, you'll see a sort of shell of a structure that sort of tells you what this house looked like, but there are also sort of flat screens up and narratives that tell you about the lives of the enslaved who worked and lived in this house. This house was packed to the gills. The Washingtons were there. They brought 2 of of Martha Washington's grandchildren to live in this home. 9 enslaved people, secretaries, their wives, their kids, and a whole bunch of servants. It was packed. And I do this, I remind students, I sort of remind them about what privacy meant in the 18th century. There was absolutely none for anybody, including George Washington. So in the room where George and Martha Washington slept, next to that was the room of one of their grandchildren, Jackie, Custis, and that was the room that Ona slept in. So she slept next to the Washingtons every night while she lived in Philadelphia. Philadelphia was extremely different from New York. By the time that Ona arrives in New York, in Philadelphia in 1790, slavery is almost gone. There are thousands of free Black people, a few hundred enslaved. So she arrives and she is the oddball, right? The Washingtons come, they bring their slaves, and Black freedom is palpable. And there's absolutely no way to prevent Ona and the other enslaved people from seeing it. So this becomes a difficulty and a problem for the Washingtons, who are committed to bringing slaves with them to live in Philadelphia. So George Washington is off on a southern tour, and Martha's at home in Philadelphia, and she receives a visit from the Attorney General. And he comes with bad news. And he says, I got to talk to you about this. I'm paraphrasing. I got to talk to you about this. I know George Washington's gone, but I need to talk to you and George Washington's secretary, Tobias Lear. He says, we have a problem. The law in Pennsylvania is problematic for us as slaveholders. The law that was passed in 1780 stated that you could come as a non-resident and visit Pennsylvania and bring your slaves with you for 6 months at a time. And if you overstayed that 6-month period, your slaves had the right to be emancipated. Now, the Washingtons knew, George knew about this law, but he figured that because he was there on business, that he was exempt from the law. Wrong. And the Attorney General comes and says, the reason I know this is true is because my slaves just repeated the law back to me and they're gone. And so this is like one of those hilarious moments where you're like, so illiterate slaves are repeating the law back to the Attorney General, right, in order to gain their own freedom. So he pays this visit to tell the Washingtons, you know, be on the lookout, beware. Tobias Lear writes this letter to George Washington asking what to do about the blacks in the family. And Washington writes back, and this is one of those moments where, as a historian, when you're reading through the letters of the presidents, you know, you pause. And he writes back, and he states basically that we're going to create a slave rotation plan. And every 6 months, we will rotate our slaves out of Pennsylvania back to Virginia. And if that's problematic, we can make a quick trip to Trenton, New Jersey, and basically restart the clock on slavery. And so, you know, I'm reading through George Washington's letters, and I'm like, George, like, what are you doing? You know, that's what you feel when you read through the letters. What are you doing? And basically, there's this line that he writes where he says, this was the kicker. He says, I wish to do this to deceive them, meaning the slaves, and the public. So it's very clear that he understands that if he's not breaking the law, which he sort of kind of was, because there was an amendment to that law, so he kind of was, he was at least breaking the spirit of the law. But it was important for him and for Martha Washington to maintain slavery up north in the house in which they lived. Once again, that didn't matter. So although Ona was rotated, Ona and the other enslaved were rotated every 6 months, it didn't prevent her from seeing black freedom, free black men and women selling their wares, selling pepper pot soup and oysters and fruits and vegetables and serving as tavern keepers or boarding home owners. Mother Bethel Church was being built literally around the corner at the same time. Black freedom was everywhere. So although the Washingtons worked this slave rotation plan for almost the entirety of his time in Philadelphia, it didn't prevent Ona from witnessing what was right in front of her eyes. February 1796, a palpable unease was felt in the Executive Mansion House in Philadelphia. A thick tension prompted Ona Judge and her enslaved companions to tread lightly around George and Martha Washington. The mail had arrived, and a letter arrived from Martha Washington's granddaughter, Eliza Parke Custis, later on Custis Law. I always show this image because this image was done by Gilbert Stuart. And the oral history behind this portrait was that Gilbert Stuart was actually painting a portrait of George Washington. And Eliza, who was visiting with the Washingtons, was annoyed that it was taking so long, and so she supposedly burst in the door, arms crossed. Gilbert Stuart thought she was more interesting to paint, so he painted her. So that's the oral history around this image of Eliza Parke Custis. But I also like to use this image because I think it gives us a little bit of a idea about who we're talking about. Eliza was known as a difficult person, temperamental, volcanic even. I also recognize that this is a moment in the 18th century where women who purported to know what they wanted were often seen as difficult and volatile and temperamental. But from all reports from her family, this was Eliza. Eliza had written home to the Washingtons, or written to Philadelphia. She was in Virginia. The Washingtons had a number of grandchildren. 2 of them were adopted by them. They came to live in New York and Philadelphia. One thing to note, Martha Washington had a number of children, and all of them died before really young adulthood. One son died during the Revolution from camp fever, so really all she had left were her grandchildren. George and Martha Washington had no biological children together. George had no biological children that we know of. There's oral history about that as well. So Eliza writes home to the Washingtons in February of 1796 and says, "I'm getting married, and you don't know him. And he's 20 years older than I am. And he's an Englishman. And he lived in India for a number of years and has 3 biracial Indian children." Like a total wild card, right? Totally nothing that the Washingtons were prepared for. They didn't even know she was sort of courting anyone. But she's basically writing to George Washington, asking for his approval. Her father was deceased. This seemed to be the right thing to do. And so there are these set of letters between Eliza and George Washington, as well as Thomas Law, her intended. And Martha and George are upset. Eventually, George Washington says, "If this is what you wish, we will approve." They don't go to the wedding, but they say, "Okay, we'll approve of it." They're worried that she's going to be taken back to England or something, and also feel as though she's not ready for marriage. March 21st, 1796, Eliza Parke Custis marries Thomas Law. And Martha Washington's deep concern for her granddaughter trumped any relationship that she may have forged with her favorite slave. Sensing that Eliza had entered into a marriage for which she was unprepared, the First Lady made a decision that she would help her granddaughter navigate through the transition of marriage. She would give Ona Judge to Eliza Custis Law. Ona knew Eliza, and we know this from the interviews that she left towards the end of her life. This was a decision that could not stand. This was the catalyst that prompted her to escape. And I'm going to read very briefly about this moment. Judge knew what the future held. Should she not heed the advice of her free black associates? She supposed if she went back to Virginia, she should never have a chance to escape. Once she learned that, quote, upon the decease of her master and mistress, she would become the property of a granddaughter of theirs by the name of Custis, she knew she had to flee. She imagined that her work for the laws would begin immediately, not after the death of her owners, prompting a fierce clarity about her future and her dislike for Eliza Custis. Quote, she was determined never to be her slave, end quote. Her decision was made. She would risk everything to avoid the clutches of the new Mrs. Law. Judge was well informed and knew that her decision to flee was far more than risky, but still she was willing to face dog-sniffing kidnappers and bounty hunters for the rest of her life. Yes, her fear was consuming, but so too was her anger. Judge could no longer stomach her enslavement, and it was the change in her ownership that pulled the trigger on Judge's fury. She had given everything to the Washingtons. For 12 years, she had served her mistress faithfully, and now she was to be discarded like the scraps of material that she cut from Martha Washington's dresses. Any false illusions she had clung to had evaporated, and Judge knew that no matter how obedient or loyal she may have appeared to her owners, she would never be considered fully human. Her fidelity meant nothing to the Washingtons. She was their property, to be sold, mortgaged, or traded with whomever they wished. And so this prompted Ona to make a decision. On May 21st, 1796, Ona Judge would leave the Philadelphia mansion and never return. This is one of the ads that I found that I talked about in the beginning of our talk today. This one came from Claypool's American Daily Advertiser. The first one that I saw came from the Philadelphia Gazette. So the Washingtons ran this ad in 2 newspapers. $10 reward, absconded from the household of the President of the United States. On Saturday afternoon, Ona Judge, a light mulatto girl, much freckled, with very black eyes and bushy black hair. She's of middle stature, but slender and delicately made, about 20 years of age. And if you move down to the bottom paragraph, I don't know if that's clear enough to see, but I found this sort of super interesting. $10 will be paid to any person, white or black, who will bring her home. So it's clear that the Washingtons know that more than likely the free black population of Philadelphia helped her escape. They were right. Ona tells us this in the interviews. At the end of her life, she never reveals a name because she understood that assisting a fugitive, assisting someone escaping from slavery was a federal crime by 1796. So this is, and you can see it's also signed by Fred Kitt, who was the steward of the Washingtons' household. When Ona makes the decision to leave, she's very clear. She doesn't know exactly where she's going to go. She's been given assistance. She boards a ship down by the Philadelphia docks and leaves and arrives in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And you all know that she's never caught. However, what you don't know is what sort of happens after that point. And that's the sort of the Washingtons' relentless pursuit of their runaway slave. Ona runs away in May of 1796. George Washington would die in December of 1799. And for all 3 of those remaining years, he would pursue her relentlessly. So he dies in December. I have documents as late as September of that year where he's still attempting to get her back. He uses his power of the presidency. He uses the Secretary of the Treasury. He uses those who are working in customs. He uses family members, all to attempt to reclaim her while he's president and then once he becomes a private citizen again. It troubles the notion, the understanding that we have about George Washington, a man who at the end of his life made certain that a specific will went into effect. It was a will that would eventually emancipate all of his slaves upon the death of Martha. This, of course, made Martha very nervous. She understood that the only thing between 120 odd people's freedom was her life. She would write to Abigail Adams, oh, there's suspicious fires in Mount Vernon. It's true, and that she was nervous about it. So she eventually emancipated all of them, all of George Washington's slaves, none of her slaves. That would be Ona. So that for the rest of Ona's life, she would live for nearly 50 years as a fugitive, constantly looking over her shoulder, knowing that she could be dragged back into the jaws of slavery at any moment. And this forced her to live secluded in the woods, a difficult life. But towards the end of that life, she gives two important interviews, one to an abolitionist newspaper in 1845 called the Granite Freeman, and the second in 1847 to the Liberator, the most well-known abolitionist newspaper at the time. She told her story. It became a part of this kind of abolitionist crusade, the peak of it in the late 1840s. And while Ona may not have called herself an abolitionist, she was certainly being connected to that generation of people. The Granite Freeman published her interview. The very next week, they introduced an article, a discussion rather, about this new guy who wrote a book about himself named Frederick Douglass. While Ona lived as a fugitive, I believe she never wanted to be forgotten. And so it's been an honor to tell her story, an honor and an obligation. I knew that I had to share her story through a book, and then also to make this book accessible for young readers. So last month, I published the middle grade version, the young readers version of Ona Judge's story, understanding that if we actually want to change the way American history is written, if we want to change the way American history is taught and learned to our students, then we've got to write for young people, not just grown-ups. And so I wrote this book, of course, for young readers, but also for teachers who desperately want to be able to include the stories of enslaved men and women every time they teach to the social studies standards, and every time they bring in George Washington and talking about the founders. There's no reason that they can't introduce Ona's story and the legacy of American slavery that happens at the very founding of the nation and before that. And so Ona's story allows me to do a couple of things. It allows me to tell a biography, to give a biography about an incredible woman, but it's not just that. I don't want to make it that small, right? This is a book about the founding of the nation through the eyes of an enslaved person. This gives us a different look. It's not a top-down founding fathers story. It's what was everybody else thinking? Who wasn't George Washington or Thomas Jefferson or Alexander Hamilton, and the list goes on. What were they thinking? How were they living? How was their labor instrumental to the building of the United States of America? And Ona's story allows me to tell that, right? She travels from the South, from Virginia to the mid-Atlantic to New England. That's all of the country pretty much at that point, right? Her travel gives us a lens into all of these different regions. And so, as I said before, and in closing, I smile when I think about what's happened since Never Caught was first published in 2017. Tens of thousands of people now know Ona's story. And as I said before, although she spent nearly 50 years in hiding, I know she never wanted to be forgotten. So thank you.
All right, well, I can only imagine that there are many, many questions that are bubbling up. And so we've got microphones on either side. Please wait for a microphone to come to you. Put your hand up. I'm going to let Dr. Armstrong Dunbar run the Q&A, but we want to be able to hear your question and we want to be able to record it. So put your hand up, the mic will get passed to you, and then I'll let her run the show from here.
I think we have a question here, we have a question there. So let's start in the front, and we'll move to you, and then in the back.
Thank you very much. It's a wonderful story, fascinating, absolutely fascinating. And of course, you're telling it to her eyes. Mm-hmm. And she was the slave. And of course, we all abhor slavery. But at the same time, there is the problem of ownership. You know what I mean by that? George Washington's sense of ownership of his property. And it seems to me that this whole experience is really an expression of Washington's fear of losing that power of ownership. And I just wondered if you could address that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great comment. I think what I tried to do by introducing Ona's story to the narrative of sort of George Washington, early U.S. history, was to show us that George Washington was struggling over his ideas about slavery and freedom. So we know that Washington writes about his discomfort with slavery. And we have to remember that he owns a significant number of slaves. At the time of his death, Martha owns more. But there are various times where his acquaintances and friends, the Marquis de Lafayette is like, George, what are you doing with all the slaves? And there are moments where he talks about trying to get quit of his Negroes. That's what he wrote several times, but never managed to find a way to do it. So this same moment that he's writing two versions of a will. One will, on his deathbed, he asks to have the wills retrieved, and he tells Martha to throw one into the fireplace, and one remains standing, and that is the will that gives freedom to his enslaved men and women. But he's literally also chasing Ona at the same time, right? And while she's technically Martha Washington's property, it's something to think about. We celebrate George Washington for being progressive in his ideas about emancipation, right? When we know that the majority of the early presidents, with the exception of the Northerners, right, owned slaves. But I pose the question, that we know George Washington wrestled with this, and it was really only his death that gave him the ability to give up tremendous wealth and property. And I ask the question, would it have been that easy to do that had George Washington had biological children who were expecting an inheritance, a son to whom 120 odd people would have been passed down? I'm not certain that decision would have been made. We don't know, right? But it's something that we need to think about. So I think you're right. He's wrestling with these issues of power, of property, and also a moral consciousness that clearly tells him slavery is wrong. So we had one right there. Can we pass that mic on down? Thank you.
Yes, when I was reading your book, and I came upon the ads that George Washington put into the Philadelphia newspapers, the question that just popped into my mind was, what fear did he have of maintaining his reputation of being an honest and the President of the United States? And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the negotiations that Ona Judge had with him, and then respond to the question, how far did he think that he could or could not push his search for Ona and still maintain his reputation?
That's like 4 questions. Okay. All right. And they're great questions. So yeah, I think that I was struck by that too. I was struck by the advertisement, like, here's the president advertising for a runaway slave in a Philadelphia newspaper, in a Quaker city, in a place where slavery had pretty much been eradicated, right? And then would spend the next few years of his life pursuing her. Why? There were over 300 enslaved people at Mount Vernon. Why? So, of course, the first thing I thought, my colleague is, a colleague and friend is Annette Gordon-Reed. I was like, what's going on between Ona and George, right? That was my first, is there something sexual behind it? I could not find that. And in a way, I'm kind of glad I didn't, because I think it sort of speaks more to the story about looking for freedom no matter what, that a certain set of situations don't have to be present for someone to pursue freedom. But it did strike me as odd. A couple of things were odd. One, that he was advertising and continued, the advertisement ran for about a week, but that he pursued her for the next couple of years. The other thing that was so odd to me was that he didn't get her back. And I'm like, how does the President of the United States not get this woman back? Doesn't that seem like weird? Doesn't it make you say, why didn't you just go throw a bag over her head, bring her, because she runs away in May. The Washingtons know where she is by August. See, I'm not trying to tell everything because I have all these books I'm trying to sell in the back, right? So, I'm not going to answer all your questions because that gives a lot of it up, right? She was never caught, but, you don't know the kind of machinations and the maneuvers that the Washingtons were going through in order to reclaim her. But I think what it reminds us of is a few things. One, and this is sort of difficult as I'm standing here with this center in particular, but thinking about how presidents abuse power. And this is a clear case in which George Washington broke the fugitive slave law that he himself signed in 1793, right, which required lawyers and trials and identification process in order to go and reclaim a slave who had crossed state lines. George Washington was clear in his own writing that he wanted none of that all of it was supposed to be done discreetly without the knowledge of the public. So once it was one of those moments where, again, I was like, George, and also saying, how are you doing this at the same time that you're talking about setting people free? You're writing a will, you're having conversations. And clearly, the whole point is to remind us about the stickiness of slavery, how entrenched African slavery was at that moment, how connected to wealth, how connected to Southern gentility it was as a Virginian. What did it mean that this man who was president of the United States could not reclaim this woman? What did that say about him? And so there are many reasons that he would, like I said, I'm not going to tell you all because you got to buy the book, but there are many reasons that he would continue to pursue her. And what's so glorious is that she's totally smart and strategic, and he fails at every turn. There was one in the back, and then we'll come to you.
Yes, thank you. I'm going to make it 2 questions. Hopefully they won't destroy the ending. First question, did she ever have children? Do we know if there are descendants alive today? Second question, did either Martha or the granddaughter have a role in pushing George to pursue her?
Yeah, that's a little bit of a mess up for the ending. But, well, so I'll answer, it's always asked, so I'll answer it. She does have children. So I spent, the one thing about tracking Ona's life is that it became very, very, it was actually easier, not easy, but easier to write more of a narrative about her life while she was enslaved than when she was a fugitive. Because what do fugitives depend upon? Anonymity. They don't want to be found. They leave very little in the way of records. But what I was able to piece together from her life as a fugitive for 50 years was that she marries, she has children. And the minute that she has children, in many ways that ups the ante of the game, right? Because not only is she a fugitive, it makes her children a fugitive. Slavery followed the apron strings of its women. So this was a condition that was passed genetically, in heredity, in terms of Ona's status as an enslaved person. So anyone coming to look for her would and could come to look for her children. Descendants. So there are no direct descendants from Ona's line. There are some descendants who are connected to one of her sisters, that we believe is connected to one of her sisters. But here's the thing. They're trying to sort of prove that connection with the folks at Mount Vernon. And that's serious business when you're making the connection between yourself and anyone connected to anyone living at Mount Vernon. And so the question is, and this is what genealogists struggle with all the time, how do you make those connections when you were enslaved and couldn't read and write and didn't have documentation of birth and didn't have documentation of death, right? You have the oral histories that are passed down. You have pieces of material culture, tea sets that were given away by Martha Washington, supposedly passed down. And so it becomes very tricky to prove this, right? But my understanding is that they're in conversation and that those are the only descendants around. No one else has popped up since Never Caught came out. Was there another question? Martha and the granddaughter's role. So we don't have any evidence that the granddaughter was involved in attempting to capture Ona. But Martha, oh yeah. In every letter that George Washington writes in his pursuit for Ona, whether it was to the Secretary of the Treasury, the customs collectors, what have you, he always writes, "My wife is very desirous of seeing her again. My wife cannot do without her, my wife." So Martha was there, was very present. Of course, though, all of the written directives and requests came from George Washington's pen. And technically, as her husband, he was in charge of the estate, of her estate. And any loss to the estate, a slave, a farm animal, was his responsibility. So George Washington would technically have to pay the estate, the Custis estate, for any slave that escaped that he was unable to reclaim. So there was a monetary issue as well. So yes, Martha was very present in this attempt to capture Ona.
I think you answered my question, but I was just curious if in your research whether or not you did find any writings from Martha about this whole situation, and obviously she had a huge influence on what happened. So.
Yeah, that's a great question. I wish Martha left very little compared to George Washington in terms of his writings. And after the death of George Washington, she burned almost all of their correspondence. Because she knew nosy people like me were going to be looking through her stuff, right? Later on, that's why, I tell my kid, I have a 14-year-old, don't text anything you don't want people to see later on in life when you're trying to be a senator or something. or an email, because that is archived in the same way, right, that we're looking at old 18th century letters. So we don't have much in the way even of a written correspondence between George and Martha because of that. She doesn't make reference to Ona in her letters. We know that she knew about the events because George mentions her in his writing, but nothing directly from her pen. Let's get you next.
Thank you so much for giving this talk. This was tremendous. I mean, I appreciate you mentioning teachers. So I contacted you out of the blue to be on my podcast, and you were willing to do that with, no payment or anything. And I'm up at UNT, and we're working on preparing social studies teachers there. And so my question is really for our students, because we're going to use your book with all 150 of our elementary students starting in the fall.
Yay! Yay!
And so as we work with them to figure out how to teach a difficult topic like this to elementary students, my question is, what do you want elementary teachers to teach about slavery? Or you could say, what do you want elementary students to know about slavery and Ona Judge?
Yeah, I definitely, thank you for that for question, and it's good to see you. So I purposefully decided to write this young reader's edition as a middle grade reader, right? Sort of understanding that older elementary kids and middle school kids would really be reading this book. And that's sort of with the understanding that kids typically hit U.S. history somewhere between fourth, fifth, usually fifth, up through seventh grade, right? So that's my target. When I decided that I wanted to write a young reader's version, that was my target audience. And I'll be honest, I'm not quite certain on how to teach slavery to people, young, small people, littler than that. It's harder even with sort of fourth and fifth graders. But what I found sort of, the book came out last month, and I'm starting to engage with students all over the country. They're so ready. They're so sharp. They already know what human trafficking is. They've had these conversations in other contexts, right? So fourth and fifth graders are just making parallels between current day human trafficking and what clearly happened hundreds of years ago. I think we're in a sort of sweet spot, if you will, to push teachers to engage slavery. There's always this sort of conversation, how do we do it? It's difficult. They're young. It's doable. It is difficult. But I argue every history about every war is difficult, right? We talk about violence. We talk about death with every war and every battle that we teach. This year commemorates the 400th anniversary of the Africans brought to Jamestown, Virginia. And I think that what I'd like to see teachers do is to engage in this sort of commemorative moment by working to change their curriculum to include the stories. And I found that by using people, biography, it's the best way to do it with younger readers, right? And I was careful, I had a co-writer with this book, Kathleen Van Cleve. Kathy is a dear friend, and she's also a YA reader. She writes for young adults and for kids, mostly fiction. And so when I decided to write this book, I kind of, it's kind of like when my toilet breaks, I don't try to fix it, I call the plumber, right? I don't know how to fix a toilet. I didn't know how to write for children, and I needed some direction. And I thought Kathy and I would make a good team. Now, Kathy writes fiction, so she's writing about rhubarbs and coming out of golden ground and like crazy fiction stuff. And so you should see the two of us, like she would write something, I'm like, Kathy, that's crazy, that didn't happen, you've got to rewrite this, that's not historically accurate. And she's like, but why can't we have this? And I'm like, because it didn't happen, right? So us it was, it was an interesting experience, one that I'll always treasure. But I think what we did was sort of hit a sweet spot, and we were very sort of cognizant of bringing in social studies standards materials that teachers have to use. So there's much more in this book about the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution, and making these connections that I didn't necessarily feel like I had to do in the adult version. So I think the short answer to your question is, what do I want teachers to teach? The truth. Yeah, we have one right there.
Hi there. First, I have a question. A comment and then a question.
Sure.
Just piggybacking off of what he said, because I'm an elementary school teacher, and I've taught pre-K, kinder for years. They're ready. They notice things that we don't think they notice. But I was going to say we need more advocates to bring books of this nature into the curriculum. I have a senior in high school. She's at Booker T. And in one school year, in her variety of classes, she was required to read 3 books that had to do with the Holocaust, but nothing that had anything to do with her own history in this country. And so we need people to be advocates that, Lord, this is the country that we were dragged into. So we need to have more stories of our history included in curriculum. So that was just my comment on that. Because as an African-American woman, and she keeps bringing these books home, so I'm like, but where are the stories about us at, So I just thought I'd make that quick comment. My second question is way like conspiracy theory left field kind of question, but Ona, what's the wife's name?
Eliza?
Betty.
No, her
George
mother was
Washington's
Betty.
wife.
Martha.
Martha, thank you. Could she, Ona, by any chance, be stepdaughter and not just do you think there could be that dynamic that maybe she's family, that her husband did some dillying and dallying and it wasn't Judge, that it could have been Daddy and they're trying to cover it up? Because there was such a level of endearment almost in the notice in the newspaper and trying to find her. So I told you, far left field.
I don't necessarily think that's far left field, because when we think about the tentacles of slavery and the way that slavery expanded itself, we know that it was based upon forced breeding, but at least by the 19th century, right? So I don't think that's too far afield. What I'll say is that I found no evidence. And as a historian, I have to go by my evidence, right? And there have been many historians, medical historians, who've argued that George Washington could have no children, right? That he had several health conditions over the course of his life that basically made him either sterile or impotent, right? And because, remember, Martha had a good number of children before she met George Washington. They met and married in their late 20s, and the fact that they had no biological children sort of begs the question, what happened there? So, if something like that were to be the case, I don't know, I guess maybe that would make the story juicier. And like I said, when I first started, I thought, my question was, why was he pursuing her so relentlessly? I really believe Martha was the one behind that relentless pursuit. I don't think there was a familial relationship, in part because Ona was one of the very few people at Mount Vernon of the enslaved who had a last name. And her surname was the surname of a man named Andrew Judge, who was indentured, who was white, who was there and eventually left Mount Vernon. I tracked him. He left and never, once his indenture was over, and he never came back. So I'm fairly confident, very confident, that Andrew Judge, as is Mount Vernon. So if you go to Mount Vernon, they agree that Andrew was her father and that Betty was her mother. But that's a story that is not unheard of, right, in the other stories and other narratives about slavery. So I don't think that's a conspiracy question to ask. I think it's actually very common when we think about the kind of treachery of slavery and that way that it impacted upon the family. But in this case, no. I believe Andrew Judge was her father and Betty was her mother. And the fact that Ona knew who her parents were and lived with them, both of them on the same plantation for a significant period of time, is also something that makes her somewhat unique, right? That was not the case for the majority of enslaved children, at least not always. And so I do think that Ona's story helps us understand even the intricacies of family, right? And another thing that we can use with, at least with teachers. Teachers always talk about, you have that family day where you're making the collage of your mom and your dad and your cousins and your grandparents and all of that. There's a way to connect, to ask students, how would it feel to not know your parents? I ask kids, how many of you in the room are 10? And, they all, hands go right up, and I say, okay, at 10 years old, Ona started her life as a slave, as a worker in the house of the Washingtons. So imagine you right now, your life changing. And that always kind of allows children to connect those kinds of questions. So I think, back to your question about what really sticks and works with kids, I think it's biography. I think it's hopefully good writing, and a book that will draw them in and allow them to make connections. So thank you all. Thanks very much.
Even if our guests had not said anything about it, I would have said something. Both of these books are out there for sale. I and my son are going to be going through this book very soon. That's what you get for being the son of a historian. Yep. But we're going to be going through this really soon. I encourage you to buy those. We will be out there at the front table where she's willing to sign your book and talk to you a little bit more out there. But thank you so much for coming tonight, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks.